Cop sees black man's car, unaware he is a Homeland Security agent. It was a regular Tuesday afternoon when Marcus Walker, a 36-year-old Homeland Security agent, decided to drive across town to visit a friend. As a government agent, he was no stranger to high-pressure situations, but today was just supposed to be a break from the usual hustle. He was looking forward to some downtime, hoping the traffic wouldn't be too heavy. Little did he know, this drive would turn into a day he would never forget. Marcus was always careful about his driving. He made sure to follow the rules of the road, keeping his speed within limits and his eyes on the street. His car, a sleek black sedan, was a reflection of his professional life, well-maintained and tidy. As he cruised down the highway, he noticed the usual blend of commuters around him. Some were in a rush, others just going about their business. Marcus felt relaxed, comfortable in his routine. But then, as he passed a small shopping plaza, Marcus saw the flashing lights of a police car in his rearview mirror. He didn't panic, but something about the way the car was tailing him felt different. Marcus was used to being pulled over from time to time, but there was an odd sense of urgency in the way the officer's lights blinked. He glanced in the mirror again, making sure his seatbelt was fastened, and his hands were visible on the wheel. He signaled and slowly pulled over to the shoulder of the road. The officer's car came to a halt behind him. Marcus exhaled and rolled down his window as the officer walked up to his car. The officer, a middle-aged man with a stern look on his face, seemed serious but not unfriendly. "Good afternoon," the officer said, peering into the car. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Marcus shook his head, his mind already trying to process what was happening. "No, officer, is there a problem?" The officer glanced at his clipboard, then looked back at Marcus. "You were going a bit faster than the posted limit back there," he said, his tone neutral. "I'm going to need to see your driver's license and registration." Marcus nodded, understanding the routine. He reached into his glove compartment and pulled out the required documents. He handed them over, careful to make sure his movements were slow and deliberate. He knew the importance of staying calm, no matter the situation. The officer took the documents and walked back to his car, leaving Marcus alone in the silence of his vehicle. As the seconds ticked by, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had been pulled over plenty of times, but this time the officer's presence seemed heavier. The officer had barely said anything about the supposed speeding violation, and Marcus was certain he had been driving within the limits. His mind wandered for a moment. Could this be a case of racial profiling, or was it simply a mistake? After what felt like an eternity, the officer returned to Marcus's car. "Everything checks out," the officer said, handing the documents back. Marcus was relieved to hear this. But before he could even thank the officer, the tone shifted. The officer's expression hardened and he took a step back from the car. "Hold on a second," he said, his voice growing more serious. "I'm going to need to search your vehicle." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. A search. What was going on? He had been polite, followed the rules, and yet here he was, being treated as if he were a suspect in something larger. The officer didn't offer any explanation, but Marcus complied. He was a professional, and he knew that resisting an officer's request could make things worse. Besides, Marcus had nothing to hide. The officer reached into the car and began to open the glove compartment. Marcus watched, his stomach tightening with each movement. As the officer flipped open the compartment, he pulled out a few items, a packet of gum, a pair of sunglasses, and then a badge. It was Marcus's badge. A Homeland Security badge. The officer's hand froze. He stared at the badge for a moment, his eyes flicking between the ID and Marcus. "Homeland Security," the officer muttered under his breath, as if unsure of what to do next. "What's this about?" Marcus's mind raced. This was the moment. The moment he would have to explain everything. But he knew that being too quick to speak might only confuse things further. He tried to remain calm, speaking slowly. "I'm an agent with Homeland Security," he said. "I'm off duty today, just on my way to a friend's house." The officer's eyes widened and he took a small step back. I didn't realize," he stammered. Marcus didn't blame him entirely. Being a law enforcement officer was a difficult job and mistakes were bound to happen. Still, something didn't sit right with him. Why hadn't the officer recognized the badge earlier? Why hadn't there been any acknowledgement of who Marcus was before the search? The officer cleared his throat and straightened up. "I'm sorry about this," he said, now sounding a bit more apologetic. We were just doing our routine check, but this isn't how we should have handled it. At that moment, Marcus felt a wave of frustration build inside him. He had tried to be understanding, to stay calm, but this situation was getting out of hand. He wasn't just any random driver. He wasn't just another black man on the road. He was a professional who served his country, someone trained to handle much more serious situations than this one. And yet here he was, being treated like a suspect. The officer's next words, however, would shift the situation even further. "I'll need to call this in," the officer said, still holding the badge in his hand. He turned away and began speaking into his radio, explaining the situation. Marcus didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a simple traffic stop anymore. Something bigger was unfolding, and he was at the center of it. As the officer spoke into his radio, Marcus sat in his car, feeling a mixture of disbelief and confusion. His fingers gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white from the tension. What had started as a routine drive now felt like a nightmare. The officer's voice was muffled through the radio, but Marcus couldn't focus on the words. His mind was racing, replaying the entire situation, trying to make sense of what was happening. Why was this officer so suspicious of him? Did he see a man of color in a nice car and automatically assume something was wrong? Or was this just a simple case of a mistake? The minutes ticked by, each one heavier than the last. Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of powerlessness creeping over him. He was used to dealing with difficult situations, but this was different. This wasn't a case of criminals or dangerous situations. This was a simple traffic stop that had spiraled into something far worse. He glanced at the officer, who was still speaking into his radio, his back turned. The officer seemed to be trying to get confirmation about Marcus's identity from whoever was on the other end of the line. Every now and then, the officer would glance back at Marcus, but it was clear that Marcus was no longer the focus of the conversation. The officer seemed preoccupied, as if the situation had become something bigger than either of them anticipated. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. He had been through intense training for situations that were much more dangerous than this, but sitting here, waiting for answers, felt like being trapped in an endless loop of uncertainty. He was a Homeland Security agent. He had undergone years of rigorous training, worked in high-risk environments, and handled some of the most serious national security threats. Yet here he was, sitting in his own car, feeling as if he was being treated like a criminal. After what felt like an eternity, the officer finally turned back around and walked towards Marcus's car. He still hadn't returned Marcus's driver's license or registration, and Marcus couldn't help but notice the slight unease in the officer's steps. The officer's earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a sense of uncertainty. "Sir," the officer said, his voice softer now, "I'm really sorry about this." Marcus looked at the officer, trying to remain calm, but his frustration was evident. "I told you I'm an agent with Homeland Security. I'm just on my way to see a friend. There's no need for this." The officer nodded, clearly uncomfortable. "Yeah, I understand. It's just, I've never run into a situation like this before. I wasn't expecting this. We've had some reports of suspicious activity around here, and well, I wasn't sure what to make of it." Marcus's heart sank. Suspicious activity. He was just a man driving to meet a friend, not involved in anything illegal. He had been stopped for no reason other than the officer's assumption, based solely on the color of his skin and the car he drove. "Look," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady, "I understand you have a job to do, but this isn't the way to do it. I've done everything you've asked, license, registration, and now a search. If you just checked my background, you'd see that I'm a federal agent. You don't need to go this far." The officer hesitated for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He seemed to be typing something quickly, likely double-checking Marcus's credentials. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Marcus was now growing increasingly impatient. How much longer was this going to take? His friend was waiting for him, and he had no idea how long this process would drag on. A few minutes passed, and the officer looked up, his face now tinged with embarrassment. "Okay," he said slowly, "I've confirmed everything. I'm really sorry about all of this. We should have done this differently. I can release your car now, but I'll need to file a report." Marcus's frustration flared. He had spent over half an hour of his day being treated like a criminal, all because the officer had failed to recognize his credentials. A simple check of his background would have revealed everything, yet the officer had proceeded with the stop, as if Marcus were just another random person to suspect. It felt like the officer had doubted him the moment he had seen him. "I don't need you to file a report," Marcus said, his voice firm. "I need you to do your job correctly next time. Don't assume that just because someone looks a certain way, they're guilty of something. I'm not some suspect on the street. I'm an agent of the law. If you had just checked my ID earlier, this whole mess wouldn't have happened." The officer nodded, though he didn't seem to know how to respond to Marcus's anger. "I understand. Again, I'm really sorry. This is more complicated than I thought. You're free to go now." Marcus took a deep breath, trying to let go of the mounting anger inside him. He was still shaken, but there was nothing more to say. He didn't want to escalate things any further, especially not when the officer was finally acknowledging the mistake. But even as he put the car in drive and prepared to leave, a part of him was still furious. He had been wronged, and he knew it. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a result of systemic issues, of preconceived notions, and of the way people of color were often treated by those in positions of authority. As he drove away, Marcus couldn't help but replay the incident in his mind. The feeling of being judged for no reason other than his race, the officer's assumption that he was doing something wrong, all of it felt suffocating. How many times had this kind of thing happened to others like him? How many times had people been treated unfairly just because of the way they looked? The rest of the drive was a blur. Marcus's thoughts were consumed by what had just happened. He couldn't shake the feeling of injustice, of being unfairly treated despite his position. The incident wasn't over for him, it was only just beginning. What would happen next? Would anyone listen to his story, or would this be just another case swept under the rug? One thing was certain, this was a wake-up call. The world needed to change. And maybe, just maybe, this incident was the first step in Marcus's journey to make sure it did. As Marcus continued to drive away from the scene, the weight of what had just happened settled heavily on him. The tension that had been building inside him didn't fade as he expected. It lingered, gnawing at him, and he couldn't shake the images of the officer's face when he'd pulled out the Homeland Security badge. Marcus had always carried that badge with pride, a symbol of his dedication to the job. It wasn't just an ID card. It was a testament to the years of training and hard work he had put into keeping the country safe. But today, it had become a symbol of something entirely different: suspicion, confusion, and most of all, misunderstanding. As he drove through the city streets, Marcus thought about how easily the situation could have escalated. He had been pulled over, questioned, and treated with suspicion simply because of his appearance. He was a black man in a nice car, and to some, that alone was enough to raise doubts about his intentions. The officer hadn't known who he was at first, and the fact that it had taken so long for the situation to be resolved only confirmed what Marcus already knew. People of color were often viewed through a lens of suspicion, no matter their position or background. Marcus shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. He didn't want to dwell on it too much. After all, the officer had apologized and the situation had been cleared up. He had his badge back, his car was being released, but still the unease lingered. Why had things gone so far in the first place? Was this really just a simple mistake, or was it something more? The following day, Marcus received a call from the police department. The officer who had pulled him over was on the line. He sounded apologetic, but also uncertain, like he wasn't quite sure what to say next. "Hello, Mr. Walker. It's Officer Daniels from yesterday," the voice on the other end said. "I wanted to follow up with you. I know we had a rough start, and I just wanted to make sure everything was sorted out on your end." Marcus listened quietly, his frustration from the previous day still fresh. "Yeah, everything's fine now," he said, trying to keep his voice even. "You got everything cleared up." "I appreciate the apology, but honestly, I'm still trying to wrap my head around how this all happened." "I understand," Officer Daniels replied, his voice genuine. "I just want to be clear about something. I didn't realize who you were at first, and I definitely should have checked your ID more thoroughly. I'm just a little shaken up myself. We get a lot of reports of suspicious activity around here, and I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. That was wrong." Marcus took a deep breath. He appreciated the officer's words, but they didn't fully resolve the feeling of being unfairly targeted. "It's not just about the mistake," he said. "It's about how the situation escalated so quickly." If I hadn't been carrying my badge with me, would this have ended differently? Would you have still assumed I was someone to be treated with suspicion? There was a long pause on the other end. Marcus could hear the officer shifting in his seat. I get it, he said finally. You're right, I didn't give you the benefit of the doubt, and I should have. I'm sorry for that. I've been doing this job for years, but this is a reminder that sometimes we have to check our assumptions before we act. Marcus nodded even though the officer couldn't see him. Yeah, it's just frustrating. I've worked hard to get where I am and to be treated like I'm some kind of threat. It's a tough pill to swallow. Officer Daniels sighed. I understand, Marcus, and I'm glad we could clear things up. But I'll be honest with you, this is a learning moment for me. I'm going to take a hard look at how I handle situations like this in the future. For a moment, Marcus was quiet. It felt like the officer was genuinely trying to make amends. Still, the sense of injustice lingered. Well, I appreciate the call, Marcus said. But this isn't just about one person. It's bigger than that. I'm not the only one who gets treated this way, and I'm sure there are many others who go through the same thing every day just because of how they look. The officer was silent for a moment before speaking again. You're right. It's not just about us as individuals, it's about the system as a whole, and I think that's something we all need to take a closer look at. Marcus felt a strange sense of resolve in the officer's words. It wasn't much, but it was a step in the right direction. Maybe things could change. Maybe, just maybe, this situation could be part of a larger conversation. After the call, Marcus went about his day, but the thought of what had happened stuck with him. It wasn't just a story about a routine traffic stop gone wrong. It was a story that spoke to deeper issues, the assumptions people made about him based on the color of his skin, the way he was seen before he even opened his mouth. It was a reminder of how even the smallest encounter could be clouded by prejudice. The next morning, the media picked up the story. News outlets were quick to report on the misunderstanding between the officer and the Homeland Security agent. Headlines framed it as an isolated incident, a mistake by an overzealous cop who had failed to recognize the agent. But as the story spread, more people began to question how often these kinds of things happened, how often people of color were treated differently, even when they had done nothing wrong. Marcus didn't seek out the media attention, but it came anyway. He wasn't sure how to feel about the growing buzz around the incident. On one hand, he knew it was drawing attention to the very issues he'd experienced. On the other hand, he didn't want to be seen as just another victim of the system. He didn't want the story to be about him. It was about something much larger, something that affected millions of people every day. He received messages from people he knew, from colleagues in Homeland Security, and from strangers who had read the news. Some expressed sympathy, others were angry on his behalf. Some simply didn't understand what all the fuss was about. It was just a mistake, right? But to Marcus, it was more than just a mistake. It was a sign of something that needed to change, something that couldn't be ignored. For Marcus, this wasn't just a story about a day gone wrong. It was the beginning of a new awareness, both for him and for others. He had always known that racial profiling existed, but experiencing it firsthand had been eye-opening. And as the story continued to unfold, he knew he had a choice. He could move on, let it go, and let the world return to normal. Or he could use this moment to spark a conversation that needed to happen. A conversation about how we see each other, how we judge each other, and how we can do better. Marcus wasn't sure what the next step was, but he knew he had to take it. Because even if this was just one small incident, it had the power to make a difference. It could be the catalyst for change, and that was something worth fighting for. The days following Marcus's run-in with Officer Daniels felt like a blur. He had hoped that the incident would quickly fade into the past, but the reality was far from that. News outlets continued to report on the misunderstanding, framing it as an unfortunate mistake. Some praised the officer for his apology and commitment to learning from the experience, while others were more critical, pointing out the deeper, more troubling issues that underlay the encounter. Marcus could hardly escape the conversation. Everywhere he went, people seemed to be talking about it. Friends, coworkers, even strangers who had read the reports. Though the media attention had started to die down, Marcus was left to process everything on his own. He had always known that racism was real, but this experience, this direct encounter, had shaken him in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the fact that he had been wrongfully stopped, or that the officer had made assumptions based on his race. It was the feeling that he wasn't seen for who he truly was. A Homeland Security agent with years of service, yet in that moment, he had been just another black man behind the wheel of a car. In the days that followed, Marcus found himself reflecting on the incident more deeply than he ever had before. The apology from Officer Daniels had been genuine, but it didn't erase the sting of the event. The officer had acknowledged his mistake, but what about the system that allowed these kinds of situations to happen in the first place? What about the fact that people of color, particularly black men, were often subjected to scrutiny for no other reason than their appearance? Marcus had always prided himself on his professionalism, on the fact that he had earned his position through hard work and dedication. But in that moment, none of that seemed to matter. The system wasn't concerned with his credentials, his background, or his integrity. It was concerned with how he looked on the outside. He had worked for years to rise above the stereotypes and biases, only to find himself facing the harsh reality that those stereotypes were still alive and well, lurking beneath the surface. As he sat in his office one morning going over paperwork for an ongoing case, Marcus's phone buzzed. It was a message from his partner, an agent he had worked with for years. The text was simple: "You doing okay?" It was a question Marcus had been asked a lot lately, but it still struck him every time. "Yeah, just processing," he typed back. "I'm fine, just a little shaken." He didn't tell his partner the whole story, didn't go into detail about how difficult it had been to shake the feeling of being judged. But he appreciated the check-in. He appreciated that someone cared. The next day, Marcus found himself at a community event organized by a local nonprofit that focused on building trust between law enforcement and communities of color. It had been scheduled weeks before the incident, but after everything that had happened, Marcus felt a strange sense of urgency to attend. He wasn't sure if he wanted to speak up or if he just wanted to listen. Either way, he knew that the event was an opportunity for change, a chance to be part of something larger than himself. As he entered the venue, he was greeted by a sea of familiar faces, some from his department, others from local community leaders, and some from families who had been directly impacted by police violence and racial profiling. There was a palpable tension in the air, but also a sense of hope. People were ready to have the hard conversations, to face the uncomfortable truths that had been ignored for far too long. Marcus made his way to a seat near the back of the room, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on him. He wasn't sure why he had come, whether it was to hear others speak, or to somehow make sense of his own feelings. But as the event began, Marcus found himself drawn into the conversation. A local activist stood at the front, passionately speaking about the need for reform in policing. "We need accountability," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "We need officers to recognize the biases that exist within them, and we need to change the culture that allows these biases to thrive." Marcus couldn't help but nod along. She was right. It wasn't just about one officer making a mistake. It was about the system that allowed that mistake to happen in the first place. It was about the countless people who had experienced the same thing, day after day, without ever being given a chance to explain themselves. The activist continued, "We need to ensure that every person, regardless of their race or background, is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. And that starts with all of us." Marcus's mind raced. He knew that change couldn't happen overnight, but he also knew that change had to start somewhere. He had always believed in the importance of his work, keeping the country safe, ensuring national security. But now he realized that his job didn't end with just fighting crime. He had a responsibility to fight for justice in every form it took, especially when it came to racial inequality. The event continued, with more speakers sharing their thoughts on how to improve relationships between law enforcement and the communities they served. But as the afternoon wore on, Marcus's thoughts kept drifting back to the officer who had stopped him. Officer Daniels had made an honest mistake, but it was part of a much larger issue. It wasn't enough to just apologize. It wasn't enough to just learn from the mistake. Real change required a shift in mindset, a shift that needed to happen not just on an individual level, but across the entire system. By the end of the event, Marcus felt a sense of clarity he hadn't expected. He knew that this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been affected by the same kind of treatment. The people who had been stopped, searched, or questioned without cause. the people who had been judged before they even had a chance to speak. Marcus left the event with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just going to let this go. He couldn't. He wasn't sure how to begin, but he knew that he had a role to play. Whether it was through his work as an agent, through speaking out, or through his own personal actions, Marcus knew that the journey for change had to start with him. But more importantly, he realized that it wasn't enough to wait for others to make the change. It had to start with all of them. It had to be a collective effort, a commitment to doing better, to being better. And that was where Marcus would begin. The moment Marcus Hayes stepped out of the police station, he felt a strange mix of relief and unease. His car had finally been returned to him, and the officers had apologized, but the memory of the confrontation still burned in his mind. He ran his hand over the roof of his vehicle, trying to shake off the tension, yet every detail of the earlier encounter replayed like a film in his head. He remembered the look on the officer's face when he had finally confirmed Marcus's identity with Homeland Security. Shock, embarrassment, and a hint of respect. But Marcus knew that respect had come too late to erase the anxiety, the fear, and the judgment he had felt. As he drove home, Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror, noticing the city streets filled with people going about their evening routines, oblivious to what had happened just hours ago. He thought about how often people make assumptions based on appearances. A man in a nice car driving through a wealthy neighborhood suddenly becomes suspicious in the eyes of someone else, simply because he did look the part. The thought made his stomach tighten. He had spent years training in Homeland Security, dealing with high-risk situations, and yet today he felt powerless, not because of a criminal threat, but because of misunderstanding and bias. When he arrived home, Marcus was greeted by the familiar warmth of his small apartment. He took a deep breath and sank into his armchair, trying to process everything. His mind wandered back to the officers. He had seen good police officers in his work before, men and women who risked their lives to protect others. But today, even the good intentions had collided with assumptions and fear. Marcus realized this was bigger than one incident. It was about how society often judged people too quickly without understanding the full story. He remembered the videos circulating online already. Several bystanders had recorded the encounter, capturing the tense moment when he was detained. The videos showed him staying calm, hands visible, speaking in measured tones, trying to explain his position. Some comments were supportive, praising his patience and professionalism. Others were quick to criticize, some repeating assumptions without knowing the facts. Marcus sighed. He had learned long ago that the internet could be both a platform for justice and a place where misunderstanding spread like wildfire. Over the next few days, Marcus noticed subtle changes around him. Local news outlets had picked up the story, highlighting the incident as an example of the need for better communication between law enforcement and the community. He read articles discussing implicit bias, systemic assumptions, and the importance of verification procedures when encountering someone in an unexpected role. Marcus felt a mix of vindication and exhaustion. It was good to see meaningful conversations beginning, but it was frustrating that it had taken such a tense moment to spark them. At work, Marcus's colleagues had mixed reactions. Some congratulated him on keeping his composure under pressure, while others were more concerned about the risks he had faced. "You could have been hurt," one of his coworkers said. "We train for threats, but this shouldn't happen," Marcus nodded. He agreed, but he also knew that the incident wasn't just a personal risk. It was a mirror reflecting broader societal challenges. Even trained professionals could face danger in unexpected ways, not always from criminals or terrorists, but from assumptions, misunderstandings, and bias. The officers involved had undergone internal review, and Marcus was invited to share his perspective. Sitting across from the chief of police, Marcus described the encounter in detail, carefully explaining how the situation escalated and how simple verification procedures could have prevented it. The chief listened intently, occasionally nodding, taking notes. Marcus didn't speak with anger or blame. He spoke with clarity and honesty, hoping that his experience could serve as a lesson. By the end of the meeting, the chief promised to implement better verification protocols and training sessions to avoid similar incidents in the future. Marcus felt a small sense of accomplishment, knowing that his ordeal might prevent others from facing the same experience. But even as positive changes began to take shape, Marcus couldn't shake a lingering unease. He thought about the countless people who had no federal credentials, no safety net, and who might face similar treatment daily. For them, there was no verification phone call to Homeland Security, no automatic return of property, and no public acknowledgement of a mistake. Marcus realized that while his story would be remembered and shared, many others' stories went unheard. He felt a renewed commitment to advocacy, both in his professional role and in his personal life, to speak out about fairness, justice, and the importance of treating every individual with dignity. One evening, as Marcus walked through the city park near his apartment, he noticed families enjoying the quiet winter evening. Children ran ahead, their laughter echoing through the trees. Couples strolled, holding hands, wrapped in scarves against the cold. Marcus paused, watching the scene, and thought about resilience, the quiet, everyday strength people showed, even when the world treated them unfairly. He thought about his own resilience and how he had stayed calm under pressure, even when it felt as if the world had turned against him for no reason. Back at home, Marcus reflected further. He remembered how the officers had apologized, albeit awkwardly, and how one had admitted, "I should have checked first." It was a small moment, but it carried meaning. Change often began with small acknowledgments, small gestures of honesty. Marcus hoped that these officers would carry the lesson with them, not just for him, but for every person they might encounter in the future. It wasn't just about preventing another incident with a federal agent. It was about recognizing humanity in everyone they met. The media attention had brought unexpected messages of support as well. Marcus received emails from strangers, expressing gratitude, sharing their own experiences with misunderstandings or profiling, and offering encouragement. Some were heartfelt stories of resilience, others were calls for systemic change. Marcus read them all, feeling a connection to a wider community he hadn't realized existed. It reminded him that his personal ordeal had opened a window to larger conversations about fairness, justice, and the everyday courage it took to navigate life in a world that often judged too quickly. By the end of the week, Marcus had returned to a sense of normalcy, though his perspective had subtly shifted. He drove his car more carefully, not because of legal concerns, but because he was acutely aware of how quickly an ordinary moment could turn tense. He smiled at strangers on the street, acknowledging their presence, and felt a quiet gratitude for small acts of civility. And though the incident had shaken him, it had also strengthened him. Marcus knew that resilience wasn't just about surviving dangerous situations. It was about learning, reflecting, and using experience to make the world a little safer and more just for others. In the weeks that followed, Marcus occasionally revisited the park, sometimes sitting quietly on a bench watching life unfold. He thought about how fleeting misunderstandings could become powerful lessons if approached with patience and wisdom. And he carried a quiet hope that society could learn, little by little, to see beyond appearances, to verify carefully, and to treat every person with the respect they deserved, because the cost of not doing so could be felt by anyone at any time. By the time the winter snow began to melt, Marcus felt a sense of closure. The car incident was behind him, but the lessons remained vivid. He had experienced firsthand how fear, assumptions, and miscommunication could escalate a situation unnecessarily. He had seen both the harm it could cause and the potential for learning and change. And most importantly, he had seen the resilience of people, their ability to face injustice, maintain dignity, and work toward a fairer future. Marcus's story became more than just an isolated incident. It became a quiet reminder to himself and others that every encounter mattered, that every assumption could be questioned, and that patience, calm, and reflection could turn moments of tension into opportunities for understanding and growth. After the incident with his car and the police, Marcus Hayes felt that something inside him had shifted. The immediate fear and frustration had faded, but a quiet reflection had taken its place. He often thought about how quickly ordinary life could turn confusing or even threatening. Driving home, walking down the street, or simply being in public could suddenly feel like stepping into unknown territory. But more than fear, Marcus felt responsibility. Responsibility to himself, to others, and to the lessons that experience had taught him. In the days that followed, Marcus returned to his work at Homeland Security, but he approached it with a new perspective. Every task, every report, and every interaction seemed to carry a subtle reminder of what had happened. He noticed things he hadn't before, the assumptions people made, the way authority was perceived, and the invisible barriers that often shaped encounters between citizens and law enforcement. Marcus realized that these barriers weren't always intentional. Often, they were habits, learned behaviors, and shortcuts people used to navigate a complex world. But he also knew that these habits could have serious consequences, and he wanted to do something about it. At the office, Marcus shared his experience with his colleagues, not as a complaint, but as a lesson. He spoke about the importance of verifying credentials, the impact of assumptions, and the subtle ways bias could affect daily life. His coworkers listened carefully, some nodding in agreement, others thoughtful, absorbing the story in silence. Marcus's story reminded them that even highly trained agents could encounter challenges that had nothing to do with their work performance, skill, or judgment. It was about perception, misunderstanding, and human error, and the need to address it proactively. Marcus also reflected privately on the lessons for himself. He realized that being calm, patient, and professional during the incident had not only protected him, but it had also set an example. Remaining composed in tense situations was a skill he had learned over years of training, and now he understood its broader value. Life often presented situations where the stakes weren't about immediate danger, but about dignity, fairness, and how one carried themselves under pressure. Marcus felt a quiet pride in how he had handled the encounter, and he hoped that his example could help others facing similar challenges. Beyond work, Marcus began engaging with the community more intentionally. He spoke at local events, sharing his story in a way that encouraged dialogue and reflection. He emphasized understanding, empathy, and patience, urging people to question assumptions before acting. Marcus also highlighted the importance of proper training for police officers and first responders, sharing practical suggestions for verification procedures and communication strategies. These talks were met with curiosity and appreciation. People thanked him for his honesty and insight, noting that his experience could serve as a learning tool for both citizens and law enforcement. At home, Marcus's reflection continued in quieter ways. He started keeping a journal, writing down thoughts about encounters, challenges, and moments that could serve as opportunities for learning. He wrote about the incident itself, the emotions he felt, and the insights he gained. This process helped him process lingering frustration and transform it into productive reflection. Writing became a tool for understanding himself and the world around him. Every entry reminded him that change often began within, with awareness, patience, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. One evening, Marcus took a long walk through his neighborhood, the winter air crisp and clear. He noticed the way people moved through the streets, their gestures, expressions, and small interactions. Some seemed hurried, others relaxed, and he wondered how many people carried invisible burdens like his own. He thought about those who might face misunderstanding or bias daily, without the safety net of federal verification or public attention. Marcus felt a deep sense of empathy. He understood that his experience, while significant, was a glimpse into a broader reality, one that required compassion and action. The police department, following internal reviews and discussions prompted by Marcus's incident, began making subtle but meaningful changes. Officers received additional training focused on verifying credentials, handling tense situations calmly, and recognizing unconscious bias. Marcus observed some of these sessions, offering insight and feedback based on his first-hand experience. It was rewarding to see a system gradually adapting, learning from mistakes, and aiming for better outcomes. Marcus understood that change was often slow, but small steps could accumulate into meaningful progress. Even as policy adjustments took place, Marcus noticed shifts in public conversation. Community discussions began focusing on fairness, empathy, and understanding rather than judgment and assumptions. People talked more openly about the impact of bias, both conscious and unconscious. Marcus realized that his story had become more than an isolated event. It was a lens through which others could examine their own behavior and societal systems. It was a reminder that every encounter mattered, and every moment offered a chance to respond with awareness rather than reflexive judgment. Marcus also thought about his own identity and presence in the world. Being a black man and a federal agent, he navigated dual realities, professional authority in his work and everyday vulnerability in public spaces. The car incident had underscored the complexity of this duality. He reflected on the courage it took not only to face external threats in his job, but also to face subtle forms of misunderstanding or bias outside of work. Marcus realized that resilience wasn't just about strength in moments of danger. It was about persistence, reflection, and the ongoing commitment to act with integrity in all circumstances. Family and friends became a source of strength and support during this period. They listened as Marcus recounted the incident and offered perspectives he hadn't considered. Conversations with loved ones reminded him of the human connections that grounded him, even when the world seemed unfair or unpredictable. Marcus found comfort in these bonds and recognized that change wasn't only institutional. It was personal, relational, and deeply connected to the ways people interacted and treated one another every day. Over time, Marcus noticed how the incident had reshaped his interactions with strangers. He became more observant, patient, and empathetic, noticing small signs of discomfort or misunderstanding and responding with calm assurance. He spoke with neighbors, offered guidance when confusion arose, and quietly encouraged civility in everyday encounters. Marcus realized that change could ripple outward in ways that didn't always make headlines, through small acts, thoughtful communication, and intentional awareness. One spring morning, Marcus returned to the police station, not as a participant in a confrontation, but as a guest for a community outreach program. He shared his story again, emphasizing reflection, patience, and proactive measures. The officers listened, asked questions, and engaged thoughtfully. Marcus felt a quiet satisfaction seeing the same people who had once been unsure or cautious now willing to learn and adapt. It was a testament to human capacity for growth when approached with humility and openness. Marcus also reflected on the role of media and technology in shaping narratives. The videos of his encounter had spread quickly, sparking conversations both positive and critical. He recognized the responsibility that came with visibility. Sharing his story had amplified his voice, but it had also exposed him to scrutiny. Marcus accepted this as part of the process, understanding that honesty, transparency, and consistency were vital in shaping meaningful dialogue. He hoped that the lessons learned would reach beyond individual headlines, contributing to long-term awareness and understanding. By the end of that year, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The car incident was no longer just an event, it was a turning point. It had reminded him of the fragility of trust, the importance of communication, and the ongoing work required to build fair and respectful interactions. Marcus carried these lessons into every part of his life, at work, in the community, and within his personal relationships. He felt a quiet confidence in his ability to navigate challenges while remaining principled and composed. Marcus knew that the world wouldn't change overnight, and misunderstandings would continue to happen. But he also knew that awareness, patience, and proactive efforts could make a real difference. Every conversation, every encounter, and every small act of fairness and reflection was a step toward a society that valued understanding over assumption, verification over judgment, and empathy over fear. Marcus believed that if people approached life with these principles, moments of tension could become opportunities for learning rather than conflict. As Marcus walked home one evening, the sun dipping behind the city skyline, he thought about the lessons he had learned, the changes he had witnessed, and the quiet victories that often went unnoticed. Life was unpredictable, filled with challenges both big and small, but Marcus felt ready. He had survived misunderstanding and fear with integrity. He had inspired small changes in systems and people. And he had discovered the enduring value of reflection, empathy, and personal responsibility. Looking ahead, Marcus felt hopeful. Not naive, not blind to the challenges that remained, but confident in the human capacity to learn, adapt, and grow. The car incident had been difficult, even frightening, but it had also been transformative. Marcus had seen firsthand the importance of calm, clear thinking, and empathy, and he carried those lessons into every aspect of his life. The story ended not with fear or frustration, but with a quiet determination to live with awareness, to act with integrity, and to help create a world where understanding came before assumption.